The little black girl whispered to the biker that she heard her mom crying under the floorboards last night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a quiet, warm evening in a small town in the heart of America, there was a disturbing silence that weighed heavily in the air. It was the kind of silence that seemed unnatural, something you couldn't ignore. A little black girl, no older than 8 or 9, was seen running through the parking lot of a biker bar, her small hands trembling as she clutched her chest. Her face was streaked with tears, eyes wide with fear, and her heart raced faster than her tiny feet could carry her. The sound of motorcycles roaring in the distance only grew louder as she approached the door of the bar. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even think. She simply ran, the pounding of her feet echoing in the heavy air. The moment she stepped through the door, the entire bar went silent. The bikers, rugged and tough as they seemed, stopped everything. For a split second, they looked at her in confusion, unsure of why she had come to them of all people. The little girl's voice broke the silence, barely a whisper, but enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who heard it. I heard my mom crying under the floorboards last night. The room was still for a moment, and then a low murmur spread through the crowd. Jack, the oldest of the bikers, leaned forward in his seat, his face serious and his eyes narrowing with concern. He had seen a lot in his life, but something about the girl's words hit him harder than anything he had encountered. Without saying a word, he stood up and walked toward her. His worn leather jacket creaked as he moved, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Jack's voice was calm, but there was a raw edge to it, a hint of something buried deep inside him that was ready to fight. "Maria," she whispered, her voice shaky. "My mom, she won't wake up." Jack's heart tightened. He had seen too many broken families in his time, too many kids left behind, abandoned in the wake of violence and addiction. This wasn't the first time he had been called upon to help, but something about Maria's desperate eyes struck a chord deep within him. The other bikers, who had been silent until now, began to rise from their seats, their expressions hardening. They were used to standing up for what was right, even when it meant putting themselves at risk. They had no idea who this little girl was, but they could sense the danger in her voice, the fear that only someone in a desperate situation could feel. "We're going to help you, Maria," Jack said firmly, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Tell me exactly where you live." Maria hesitated for a moment, as if considering how much to say. Then, in a soft voice, she pointed outside, towards a rundown house at the end of the street. "That way," she said. "It's just, my mom, she's sick, and my stepdad. He's always angry." Jack nodded. Without another word, he turned to the others. "Let's go. We'll take care of this." As the bikers started filing out of the bar, the sound of their boots against the floor was drowned out by the rumble of engines firing up. In seconds, the parking lot was filled with the sound of roaring motorcycles, the bikers preparing for what would undoubtedly be a dangerous ride. The town had always been quiet, peaceful even, but it was about to change. The night was young, but the stakes were high. The bikers had no idea what they were walking into, but one thing was certain: they would not back down. This wasn't just about a little girl. It was about something bigger. It was about family. As the motorcycles roared to life, the bikers formed a tight convoy, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. Jack took the lead, his dark sunglasses reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights as they sped down the road, the wind whipping through their hair. Behind him, the rest of the crew followed, each rider focused, ready for whatever they might face. They didn't need to speak. Their actions said it all. This wasn't just a ride, it was a mission. The urgency in the little girl's voice was still fresh in Jack's mind. He could still see her tear-streaked face and hear her desperate whisper. "My mom, she's crying under the floorboards." That single sentence had sealed their fate. As the convoy drove through the quiet streets, the night grew heavier, the tension in the air palpable. The town, usually so peaceful, now felt like a backdrop to something much darker. The bikers knew this wasn't just another call for help. there was something much bigger at stake. The girl, Maria, had given them the address, and they were almost there. Jack's thoughts raced, wondering what they would find at the end of this journey. Would they be too late? Would the mother be alive? Or would they find something even worse? As they neared the rundown house at the end of the street, the group slowed their pace, engines cutting through the silence with mechanical precision. The house loomed in front of them, dark and eerie, with broken windows and overgrown weeds in the yard. The kind of place you knew had been forgotten by time and people alike. Jack brought his bike to a stop in front of the house, the gravel crunching under the weight of the tires. The rest of the bikers followed suit, parking in perfect formation. They dismounted quickly, their heavy boots making no sound on the cracked pavement. Maria had slipped away from Jack's side earlier, her small hands shaking as she led them towards the door. The moment she reached the old, weathered front porch, she stopped and turned around. Her eyes were filled with fear, and for a moment, Jack could see the helplessness in them. "This is where I live," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack gave her a reassuring nod, his face hard but kind. "We're here for you," he said softly. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a semblance of comfort. But as they approached the door, Jack could feel the weight of the situation settling in his chest. This wasn't just about a broken family. This was about a child in danger. The door creaked open as they stepped inside. The smell of stale air and mildew hit them immediately, and Jack's stomach turned. The house was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a single lamp in the corner. The furniture was sparse, old, and covered in dust. The walls, once white, were now a faded yellow, peeling in some places. It was the kind of place you couldn't imagine a child growing up in. The sound of Maria's soft footsteps was the only noise, followed closely by the heavy footfalls of the bikers behind her. They moved cautiously, aware that this place held secrets. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they made their way deeper into the house. Jack's hand tightened around the grip of his leather jacket. "Where is she, Maria?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady. Maria didn't answer right away. She just looked around the room, her eyes searching, as if expecting her mother to appear at any moment. Then, with a hesitant voice, she pointed to a bedroom door at the far end of the hall. "In there," she whispered. Jack motioned for the others to stay back, and with a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, the air thick with dust. Jack's eyes scanned the room, but it wasn't until he stepped closer to the bed that he saw her. The mother lay on the bed, her body limp and unmoving. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Her face was drawn and gaunt, her eyes closed, her hair tangled and matted. Jack could see the signs of neglect, the signs of someone who hadn't been cared for in a long time. "She's alive," one of the bikers, Vince, said from behind him. He was a medic and immediately went to check her vitals. "But she's in bad shape, severely malnourished and dehydrated. I'm going to need help." Vince's voice was calm, but Jack could tell he was worried. This wasn't just a simple case of illness. This woman was in serious danger. He looked at the others, his eyes hardening. "We need to get her out of here," he said. "We'll call for help, but I need her safe first." The bikers quickly moved into action, securing the house and ensuring there were no immediate threats. They knew they were walking a fine line between helping and putting themselves in danger, but none of them hesitated. They were a family, and no one was going to leave a child in harm's way. As Vince began to administer aid, Jack stood watch, his mind spinning with what to do next. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was a fight, and they were about to go to war. The sounds of their radios crackled in the silence, the tension thick in the air. Jack clenched his fists. Whatever happened next, they wouldn't back down. Not for a child, not for a mother. They would fight until the very end. The house was silent except for the faint sounds of the wind outside and the soft murmurs of the bikers as they worked. Jack stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching as Vince carefully checked the mother's pulse again. His eyes narrowed in concentration. He had seen this kind of thing before. People broken by the weight of life's cruelty, and it always angered him. But something about this situation was different. This wasn't just another case of neglect or bad luck. This was personal. The look in Maria's eyes earlier had unsettled him. He knew something was wrong, something much deeper than what he had seen on the surface. "She's stable for now," Vince said finally, standing up. "But we need to get her to a hospital. Fast. Jack nodded. He knew that, but getting her out of here wasn't going to be easy. The house wasn't safe, and they didn't know what the stepfather might be capable of. As if on cue, the sound of tires screeching in the distance sent a chill through the room. Jack's hand instinctively reached for the handle of his bike, his mind racing. "He's here," he muttered. The rest of the bikers tensed up, eyes shifting toward the windows, scanning for any movement. "We need to move, now," Jack said. Without waiting for an answer, he marched to the front door, flinging it open with a sense of urgency. The others followed him, their heavy boots echoing against the wooden floor as they prepared to defend the woman and child at all costs. Outside, the night had fallen completely. The air was cold, and the only light came from the flickering street lamps on the road ahead. In the distance, headlights approached rapidly. Jack's heart sank as he saw a familiar silver car speeding down the street. The stepfather's car. He had arrived, and there was no turning back. "Get her inside," Jack shouted, turning to the rest of the crew. Bear, who was already on alert, moved quickly, gathering Maria and the mother to move them to safety. The bikers began to form a protective barrier around the house, their bodies tense with readiness. There was no time for hesitation. "He's not leaving with her," Jack said, his voice hard as steel. The bikers moved into position, blocking every possible exit from the house. Jack, still standing by the door, kept his eyes locked on the approaching car. He knew the risks. If the stepfather was a cop, this would escalate quickly. But none of them were backing down. This was about loyalty, about keeping a promise, and they weren't going to let a monster take a child back into a house full of terror. As the car pulled up, Jack stepped forward. He wasn't going to let the man think he could intimidate him. The engine of the silver car cut off, and the door swung open. The stepfather, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped out of the car, his cold eyes immediately locking onto Jack. His hand rested on the badge on his chest, a gesture meant to remind them who he was. "What's going on here?" the stepfather asked, his voice sharp. "I'm taking my daughter home." Jack took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Not tonight," he said. "You're not taking her." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The stepfather's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He took a step forward, clearly not used to being challenged, but Jack didn't flinch. Behind him, the other bikers stood their ground. "What's your problem, Harland?" The stepfather sneered, his voice full of venom. "You think you can just take what's mine?" Jack's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "She's not yours," he said firmly. "She's not anyone's to hurt. Not anymore." For a moment, neither of them moved. The stepfather's face twisted with rage, but Jack could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew this wasn't just about getting his way. It was about control, about fear. Jack wasn't going to let that fear control him. Behind the biker crew, Maria clutched her mother tightly, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the confrontation unfold. Jack could hear her whisper, "Please, don't let him take her." Jack's voice softened when he turned back to her. "We're not going to let him take you. You're safe here." The stepfather took another step forward, but before he could speak, Jack raised his hand, stopping him in his tracks. "I think it's time you leave," Jack said, his voice calm but deadly serious. The stepfather looked around, realizing that he was surrounded, outnumbered. His eyes flicked to the bikers, each one standing with a look of unwavering resolve. He knew he couldn't win this fight, not without a full-blown confrontation. He could feel the weight of the situation closing in on him, and for the first time, he hesitated. "This isn't over," he growled, turning back toward his car. But Jack knew that was just words. The bikers weren't going anywhere, and the promise Jack had made to protect this child wasn't something anyone could break. As the stepfather climbed back into his car and sped off into the night, Jack felt the tension in the air slowly begin to fade. The bikers relaxed, but Jack knew this was far from over. There was still the matter of the woman's safety, and the fact that they were all now in danger of facing the stepfather's wrath. But for now, they had won, and they weren't going to let go of this fight. Not for a second. As the dust settled and the silver car disappeared down the road, Jack stood at the edge of the yard, staring into the night. The cool air brushed against his face, but it did little to ease the tension that had been building inside him for hours. The bikers had done what they needed to do, protect the girl, keep her mother safe for the moment. But Jack knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He could still feel the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone, to protect his daughter no matter what. The sound of motorcycles revving echoed in the distance, the rest of the crew making sure the area was clear. As the night grew darker, the looming threat of the stepfather's return made everything feel much heavier. Jack turned toward the others, his mind still racing. The house was still a mess, filled with the remnants of violence and neglect. He had been around long enough to know that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The girl, Maria, had been through far too much for someone her age. And her mother, weak and barely conscious, had been left to suffer alone. They couldn't stay in this house much longer. It was unsafe, and the stepfather wouldn't give up that easily. "We need to get them out of here," Jack said, his voice firm. The bikers, who had been waiting quietly, nodded in agreement. No one disagreed. Bear, the giant with a scarred face, was the first to speak up. "Where do we take them?" His voice was rough, but his concern was clear. Jack looked at him, eyes narrowing. "We need to get them somewhere safe. We'll call in favors from people we trust. But first, we need to move quickly. We don't know when he'll be back, or who he'll bring with him." The bikers all exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We can take them to the safe house," Vince suggested. He was a former medic and had connections in places others didn't. Jack considered it for a moment before nodding. "All right, that's the best option. Get them ready to move." As the bikers sprang into action, getting the mother and Maria packed up and ready to leave, Jack stood by the door, keeping an eye on the street. His thoughts wandered to Tyrone again, the friend he had lost in a war far from here. Tyrone had asked him to protect his family, and now it was his job to make sure no one else would hurt them. The sound of footsteps brought Jack's attention back to the present. Maria, still clutching her mother's hand, stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. Jack knelt down in front of her, his face softening. "You're going to be safe. We're going to take you somewhere where he can't hurt you." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, her tiny hand tightening around her mother's. Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the burden she had carried for far too long. The bikers gathered around them, preparing to leave. "All right, everyone," Jack said, his voice steady. "We ride out in 2 minutes. Stick to the plan." The group moved quickly, mounting their motorcycles and firing them up one by one. The rumble of engines filled the air, louder now as they prepared to leave the house behind. Jack gave one last glance at the house that had been a prison for Maria and her mother, then climbed onto his bike. The convoy moved as a unit, the bright lights of the motorcycles cutting through the dark. The air was thick with tension as they rode, the sound of their engines the only noise in the otherwise silent town. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, his heart racing. It was a text from an unknown number. He knows. He's coming for them. Jack's heart dropped. They weren't safe yet. The ride was far from over. The bikers pushed the limits of their speed, making their way through winding roads and back alleys, doing everything they could to avoid being spotted. Jack glanced over at Maria, who was still holding her mother tightly, her eyes scanning the night. Jack could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, but he couldn't afford to show any weakness now. He had made a promise, and no matter what, he wasn't going to let anyone break it. As they approached the safe house, Jack felt a small sense of relief wash over him. They were almost there. But just as they turned the corner, Jack saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, headlights were approaching fast. Too fast. "Get down," Jack shouted, and the bikers scattered, instinctively moving to cover the group. The silver car. The stepfather. He had found them. Jack cursed under his breath, his heart pounding. They had no choice now. It was time for the final confrontation. "Hold your ground," Jack called out, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The bikers formed a line, ready for whatever was coming next. This wasn't just about keeping Maria safe anymore. It was about sending a message. And Jack wasn't about to let this bastard think he could take his family away again. The silver car skidded to a stop just yards away from the bikers, its headlights blinding in the darkness. Jack's heart pounded as he watched the vehicle idle, knowing what was about to happen. He had seen the stepfather's face before, cold, calculating, and completely out of control. This was the moment they had been dreading, the moment they would have to stand their ground and protect Maria and her mother at any cost. "Stay close," Jack muttered under his breath, turning to the others. The bikers moved into position without a word, instinctively gathering around the small group. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to suffocate anyone who dared to take a breath. The engine of the silver car roared, and the door swung open. The stepfather emerged, his broad frame silhouetted against the blinding lights. He was angry, his fists clenched at his sides as he took slow, purposeful steps toward the group. His eyes locked with Jack's, filled with venom. "This is none of your business," the stepfather growled, his voice low but dangerous. Jack didn't flinch. He took a step forward, meeting the man's gaze with a calm that was anything but reassuring. "It is now," Jack said firmly, his voice carrying a weight that surprised even him. "You don't get to do this anymore. You don't get to hurt them." The stepfather's eyes flickered with fury, and in that moment, Jack knew he had crossed a line. This wasn't just about a fight anymore. This was about protecting the most vulnerable. Behind him, the bikers stood silently, their eyes trained on the stepfather, ready for anything. Some of them had been through hell and back, but none of them had ever faced anything like this. The stepfather didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his hands reaching for Jack, but the bikers moved as one. Bear, the towering figure in the crew, stepped in front of Jack, blocking the stepfather's path. "You're not touching him," Bear said in a voice that made the air feel colder. The stepfather hesitated, his eyes flicking between the bikers, realizing for the first time that he was no longer in control. Jack could see the moment the man understood he was outnumbered, but his rage didn't subside. He stepped back, his hands still clenched, but his voice was quieter now. "You're making a big mistake," he warned, his words laced with a menacing edge. Jack didn't move. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The mistake was yours the moment you thought you could hurt your own family and get away with it." For a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a battle of wills. The stepfather was still trying to intimidate, but the bikers weren't backing down. They weren't afraid. They had fought battles before, but this wasn't about fighting. It was about standing up for what was right. The stepfather's eyes narrowed, and he glanced back at his car. "You think you can just take her from me?" he spat. "She's mine." Jack's jaw tightened. "She's not yours," he said, stepping forward. "She's a human being, and she deserves better than this." The stepfather's hand twitched, as if he were about to make another move, but before he could, Maria's voice pierced through the tension. "Please don't hurt him," she called out, her small voice trembling. The bikers froze. Jack turned slowly, seeing Maria standing behind Bear, her eyes wide with fear. She had been silent for so long, and now, here she was, the one who had called for help in the first place, standing strong even as the situation grew more dangerous. "We're not here to hurt anyone," Jack said gently, turning his focus back to the stepfather. "We're here to protect her, and we won't let you take her." The stepfather's eyes flashed with anger, but he said nothing. Instead, he stepped back, as if weighing his options. He knew, deep down, that he wasn't going to win this. Jack's eyes never left the man as he spoke again. "You'll leave. Now. And if you come back, we'll make sure you don't get near them again." The silence that followed was deafening. The stepfather's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable, defeated. His eyes flicked to Maria one last time, filled with hatred, before he turned and climbed back into his car. The engine roared to life, and the silver car sped off into the night. Jack stood there for a moment, watching it disappear down the road. His body was tense, ready for another fight, but the night was still. The danger had passed, at least for now. The bikers began to relax, their bodies loosening as the adrenaline wore off. Jack turned back to the group, his face still serious but with a sense of accomplishment. "Let's get them to safety," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of what they had just done. The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They moved quickly, gathering their gear and making sure Maria and her mother were safe before heading out. The night had been long, and though the battle was over, the fight for their future was just beginning. The ride to the safe house was long and tense. The bikers moved in a tight formation, their engines roaring as they cut through the quiet night. Jack led the way, his mind still racing. The stepfather's warning echoed in his ears, but there was no time to dwell on it. Maria and her mother were safe for now, but that didn't mean the danger was over. He had promised to protect them, and Jack never broke a promise. As they neared the safe house, The familiar outline of the secluded building came into view, nestled in the woods just outside town. The lights were dim, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. It was perfect. The bikers slowed down as they approached the property, coming to a stop in front of the small cabin. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled the atmosphere. Jack dismounted first, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He turned to look back at Maria and her mother, who had both been quiet since they left the house. Maria's face was still pale, but her eyes were filled with a mixture of relief and fear. Her mother, weak but still breathing, rested against one of the bikers as they helped her inside. "We're here," Jack said softly, his voice reassuring. "You're safe now." The other bikers quickly unloaded their gear and helped Maria and her mother into the cabin. Once inside, they settled them on a couch in the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth from the fire seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Jack sat down next to Maria, who had been clutching her mother's hand tightly. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been through. He had seen it before in other children who had endured trauma, and it always broke his heart. "We're going to make sure you're safe," Jack said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "No one's going to hurt you here." Maria looked up at him, her eyes still wide with fear, but there was a flicker of hope in them now. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Jack glanced over at the rest of the crew. The bikers were all gathered around, their expressions hard, but there was a softness to them that only those who truly understood what it meant to protect could have. They had all been in dangerous situations before, but this one felt different. "Now, we make sure that bastard doesn't come near you again," Jack said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll get the authorities involved, but we'll also make sure he knows that if he tries anything, we'll be here to stop him." One of the bikers, Vince, who had been checking the mother's vitals, nodded. "She's stable for now, but we need to keep an eye on her. She's been through a lot." Jack turned to Maria, his face softening. "You're safe here. We're not going anywhere. We'll make sure he doesn't hurt you or your mom again." The door to the cabin creaked open, and a gust of cold wind swept through the room. Jack stood up immediately, his instincts kicking in. He glanced toward the door, but it was only Bear stepping inside, his expression grim. "We've got company," Bear said quietly. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He could tell by the look on Bear's face that this was serious. The bikers immediately stood, moving toward the door, their movements swift and coordinated. "Who?" Jack asked, his voice low and calm. "It's the stepfather," Bear said, his voice tight with anger. "He's not giving up." Jack cursed under his breath. He had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. They had to act fast. "Where is he?" Jack asked. Bear paused for a moment, looking out the window. "He's outside, parked by the tree line. Looks like he's waiting." Jack's mind raced. They couldn't let him get any closer, not when Maria and her mother were in this house. He turned to the rest of the bikers. "We're not letting him get past us," Jack said firmly. "We'll take him down if we have to." The bikers didn't hesitate. They moved toward the door, ready for whatever was coming. Jack gave Maria a reassuring look before he followed the others outside. The cold night air hit him like a slap to the face, but he didn't feel it. His focus was entirely on what was about to happen. They had to make sure Maria and her mother were safe, and they weren't going to let anyone, especially the stepfather, ruin that. The trees rustled in the distance, and Jack's eyes narrowed as he saw the silhouette of a car parked just past the tree line. He could feel the tension building, the calm before the storm. As the bikers moved into position, Jack could hear the crunch of gravel underfoot. The stepfather had made his move, but they were ready. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for justice, and Jack wasn't going to let anyone get in the way of that. The night air was thick with tension as the bikers stood in formation, their eyes trained on the silver car parked just beyond the tree line. Jack's heart raced, but his face remained stoic, focused on the task at hand. He could see the silhouette of the stepfather inside the car, his figure barely visible through the tinted windows, but it was enough. He was waiting, just as they expected. Maria and her mother were inside the cabin, out of harm's reach for now, but that didn't mean they were safe. Not while the stepfather was still out there. Jack's mind raced as he weighed their options. He knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The longer they stood here, the closer the stepfather got to making a move. "We can't let him get any closer," Jack muttered to the others, his voice low but firm. "We're going to take him out of this equation, one way or another." The bikers nodded in agreement, their faces hardening with determination. They had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight. This was a battle for a child's safety, for a family's future, and they weren't about to let it slip away. Bear, the largest of the group, stepped forward, his boots making a soft crunch on the gravel. "I'll go in first," he said. "I'll make sure he doesn't have a chance to run." Jack's gaze flicked to him. Bear was one of the toughest men he knew, but Jack wasn't sure this was the right move. "No," Jack said, shaking his head. "We don't know what we're dealing with. We need to be smart about this." Vince, the crew's medic and one of the most level-headed of the group, stepped forward next. "Jack's right," he said, his voice steady. "We need to keep our distance and make sure we've got a plan in place before we move in." Jack nodded, appreciating Vince's calmness. "All right, here's the plan," he said, taking a deep breath. "We move in slowly, from both sides. I'll take the left. Bear, you take the right. We'll flank him. No one moves until I give the signal." The rest of the bikers nodded, their faces set with resolve. They had fought battles before, but this wasn't the same. This was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. This was about justice. As the bikers spread out, Jack felt his pulse quicken. The silver car still sat there, unmoving, but Jack could feel the tension in the air. The stepfather was out there, and it was only a matter of time before he made his move. Jack moved quietly through the trees, his eyes locked on the car. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Everything was still. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. Jack's hand tightened on the grip of his bike, the cold metal feeling oddly comforting. He could see the stepfather's silhouette more clearly now, and he knew it was time. He glanced over at Bear, who had positioned himself on the opposite side of the car, waiting for the signal. Jack's heart pounded as he counted down in his head. 3, 2, 1. "Now," Jack whispered into his radio. In an instant, the bikers moved as one, closing in on the silver car from both sides. Jack's muscles tensed as he sprinted forward, his boots pounding against the ground. He reached the car first, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled open the door with a swift motion, his eyes locking onto the stepfather's surprised face. The stepfather didn't have time to react before Jack yanked him out of the car, slamming him against the hood with a force that knocked the wind out of him. The stepfather gasped for breath, his eyes wide with shock. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he spat, trying to break free, but Jack's grip was unrelenting. "You're not going anywhere," Jack growled, his voice low and menacing. The rest of the bikers quickly surrounded the car, making sure the stepfather had no escape. Bear, his face inches from the stepfather's, leaned in with a cold smile. "You should have stayed away," Bear said, his voice deep and threatening. The stepfather's eyes flicked to the other bikers, realizing he was trapped. "You don't know who I am," he muttered, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. "You're nothing but a bunch of thugs." Jack leaned in closer, his voice low but deadly serious. "We're the people who protect those who can't protect themselves," he said. "And you're not going to hurt anyone again." The stepfather struggled for a moment, but it was clear he knew he was defeated. His shoulders slumped, and he stopped fighting. Jack's grip loosened, but he didn't let go. "You're done," Jack said, his voice unwavering. "This ends tonight." The stepfather's eyes burned with anger, but he said nothing. He knew, deep down, that this was over. He had lost, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the justice that was coming for him. Jack signaled to the rest of the crew. "Get him in the truck," he ordered. The bikers quickly moved to follow his instructions, securing the stepfather and making sure he wouldn't cause any more trouble. As they dragged him away, Jack took one last look at the silver car. It was over. The bikers had won. They had done what they came to do, protect Maria and her mother. The stepfather would face justice for his actions, but Jack knew that the real victory wasn't just in taking him down. It was in giving a child a chance at a better life, a chance to escape the nightmare she had lived for far too long. The stepfather had been taken away, but the feeling of danger still lingered in the air. Jack stood in front of the cabin, his eyes scanning the dark horizon, waiting for something he couldn't quite name. The bikers were all gathered inside now, their voices low, discussing what to do next. The mission was complete, but there was still the matter of keeping Maria and her mother safe. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Jack looked back toward the cabin where Maria and her mother were resting. Maria's face had softened somewhat after the confrontation, but there was still that deep sadness in her eyes. She had been through so much already, and Jack knew that the road ahead would be just as hard. He couldn't promise that everything would be okay, but he would do everything in his power to make sure they were protected. The bikers gathered around the large table, their faces filled with resolve. Jack leaned forward, his elbows on the wood, his voice calm but commanding. We have to stay one step ahead of him. We know he won't just walk away. We need to make sure he doesn't come back for them. Bear, the big man with the scarred face, nodded. We take shifts guarding them. We don't let them out of our sight. Vince, the medic, spoke next. We also need to get the authorities involved. We can't do this alone. He's connected, and that makes him dangerous. Jack sighed. He hated relying on the system, but Vince was right. They needed legal protection. I'll make the call, Jack said. But we need to be prepared for anything. The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They all knew what was at stake. Jack stood and walked toward the window, looking out into the night. The forest surrounding them was quiet, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. The stepfather would be back, and when he came, he wouldn't come alone. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. His hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip, but he paused. It was a soft knock, almost tentative. He motioned for Bear to check. Bear opened the door to reveal Maria, standing in the doorway with a worried expression on her face. Her mother was still in the background, resting on the couch, but Maria wasn't asleep. Jack gave her a soft smile. You okay? He asked. Maria nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something that Jack couldn't ignore. I'm scared, she whispered. Jack's heart clenched. He crouched down to her level, making sure to meet her eyes. I know, sweetheart. But you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you. Maria looked at him, uncertainty still in her eyes. What if he comes back? She asked. Jack's smile faded, and he took a deep breath. He will, he said, his voice firm. But we'll be ready. We'll protect you. You don't have to be scared anymore. Bear moved behind Jack, his presence offering a sense of security. You're part of our family now, Bear said, his voice deep but gentle. And family looks out for each other. Maria seemed to take comfort in this, nodding slowly. Jack stood up, his eyes still on Maria. He knew it wasn't enough, not yet. But they would make sure she knew she wasn't alone. The bikers had fought for their own, and now they would fight for Maria and her mother. They had promised Tyrone, and they would keep that promise. Get some rest, Maria, Jack said softly. We'll keep watch. As Maria walked back to her mother, Jack turned to the others. We've got to make sure we're prepared for when he comes. We can't let him get the upper hand again. The bikers nodded, each one silently agreeing. They knew what they had to do. The safe house was just that, a place to stay safe for now. But they couldn't stay hidden forever. The next steps had to be planned carefully. There was no telling when the stepfather would return, but Jack knew that they couldn't afford to wait too long. The group went into action, taking their positions around the cabin, securing every possible entry point. Jack went outside, standing near the trees, his eyes scanning the road. He didn't know what was coming next, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Maria and her mother had survived this far, but Jack wasn't going to take any chances. Not while they were under his protection. The night dragged on, the only sound the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Jack stayed vigilant, his senses on high alert. He couldn't sleep. Not now. The stepfather was still out there somewhere, waiting for his chance. But Jack wouldn't let him have it. He was ready to fight for Maria's future, for her safety, and for the promise he had made to her father. No matter what it took. The night was still, but the tension in the air was thick enough to feel. Jack stood just outside the cabin, watching the distant road, his eyes scanning the trees and the darkened horizon. The stepfather was still out there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows. Jack knew it wouldn't be long before he made his next move. The bikers had secured the perimeter, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The calm of the night was deceiving. He knew things could turn chaotic in an instant. Inside the cabin, the rest of the bikers were quietly preparing. Bear and Vince were sitting at the table, reviewing plans. Maria and her mother were resting, but Jack could see the fear still in Maria's eyes, even when she tried to hide it. Her mother's breathing was shallow, but she was stable for now. Jack had seen the signs of trauma before. He knew that Maria had already seen and experienced more than any child should have. It weighed heavily on him. Jack wasn't sure if Maria understood the danger they were in, but she certainly understood the weight of the situation. He couldn't imagine what she was thinking. The loss of her father, the terror of her stepfather, the uncertainty of their future. He turned back toward the cabin, where the faint glow of light was visible through the windows. Inside, Bear stood up from the table and walked toward Jack, his face serious. "We've got to move soon. We can't keep hiding in here forever," Bear said, his deep voice filled with urgency. "He'll come back, and when he does, he won't stop until he gets what he wants." Jack nodded, clenching his jaw. "I know, but we need to make sure Maria and her mother are ready. We need a plan. We can't rush into this without thinking it through." Bear exhaled slowly, his broad shoulders tense. "I'll make sure the rest of the crew is prepared, but we don't have much time. We need to hit him hard before he gets too comfortable." Jack turned back toward the road, feeling the weight of his promise to Maria's father. He had sworn to keep her safe, and he wasn't about to let that promise go unfulfilled. They needed to be ready for anything. They couldn't afford another mistake. Jack turned his attention back to the cabin, his mind running through scenarios. They had the element of surprise on their side, but that wasn't enough. The stepfather had experience, and with the connections he had, they couldn't underestimate him. The bikers weren't just a group of outlaws. They were a family, and they protected their own. Jack had seen them come together in the past, and this time would be no different. They would do whatever it took to keep Maria and her mother safe. The door to the cabin opened, and Maria stepped out, her eyes wide with uncertainty. She had heard the voices inside, and Jack could tell she was struggling to understand what was going on. She walked toward him slowly, as if unsure of whether she was supposed to be part of the conversation. Jack knelt down in front of her, offering a reassuring smile. "Hey, Maria," he said softly. "Everything's going to be okay. We're just making sure you're safe." Maria nodded, but Jack could see the fear still in her eyes. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the situation. "You've been so strong, but it's okay to be scared. We're here for you, no matter what." Maria's lip trembled, and for a moment, Jack thought she might break down. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded again, as if trying to reassure herself that everything would be all right. "I know you're scared," Jack continued, "but you're not alone. We're going to make sure he can't hurt you anymore. We'll make sure you're safe, I promise." Maria didn't say anything, but Jack could see her relax slightly. He gave her a soft smile and stood up. "Stay inside with your mom. We'll take care of the rest," he said gently. Maria hesitated but then nodded, walking back toward the cabin. Jack watched her go, his heart heavy with the weight of what they were facing. He turned back to Bear, who had been watching the exchange from the doorway. "We don't have time to waste," Jack said, his voice firm. "Get the others ready. We move out in 20 minutes. Bear nodded and turned to rally the rest of the bikers. Jack stood at the edge of the cabin, his mind focused on the plan. They had no choice but to act quickly. If they were going to end this, they needed to strike fast and decisively. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an engine in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. The stepfather was on his way back. It was time to finish this. Jack took a deep breath and gave one last glance toward the cabin. Maria and her mother were safe, for now. But he knew that the moment the stepfather arrived, things would escalate. It was time to protect them, once and for all. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence of the night. Jack's heart began to race. The stepfather was back, just like he'd feared. He turned to the bikers, who were already positioned, waiting for the signal. The crew was ready. They had all made up their minds. No one was going to let that man take Maria and her mother away from them. Not again. Jack moved swiftly toward the edge of the cabin, peering through the trees. The headlights of the silver car cut through the darkness like a blade. The stepfather had returned, and this time, he wasn't alone. Jack's eyes narrowed. He could see a few figures in the car with him, his backup. This was going to be harder than he'd thought. Jack quickly signaled to Bear, Vince, and the others. They needed to move. Now, without hesitation, the bikers moved into position, forming a tight circle around the cabin, making sure there were no gaps, no way for the stepfather and his goons to get past them. The last thing Jack wanted was to get caught off guard. As the car drew closer, Jack's mind raced. What was the plan now? They couldn't just charge in. The bikers had the numbers, but they didn't know what weapons the stepfather had, or how many men he had brought with him. Jack needed a way to force him into submission, to make it clear that he was outmatched. Jack moved silently, his boots barely making a sound on the ground. He approached the cabin's side, signaling to Vince to stay in position. The rest of the crew was already in place, waiting for the moment to act. The car finally stopped in front of the cabin, its headlights illuminating the area. Jack could see the stepfather and two other men get out of the car. They weren't just here to talk. The stepfather's anger was evident, his face twisted in a snarl as he looked at the cabin. This wasn't just about getting Maria back anymore. This was personal. Jack clenched his fists, ready to move. He wasn't going to let this man get away with what he had done. He had already taken too much from this family. As the bikers positioned themselves, Jack could hear the voices of the men approaching the cabin. The stepfather's words were sharp, filled with venom. "I'm not leaving without her," he shouted. Jack's eyes locked onto the stepfather, and with a swift movement, he stepped out of the shadows. "You're not taking her," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with authority. The stepfather stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto Jack's. There was a moment of silence. Then, the stepfather's eyes flared with anger. "You're going to regret this," he snarled. He reached into his jacket, his hands searching for something. Jack's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The two others tried to rush in, but the bikers were already on them, moving faster than the stepfather's crew had anticipated. Bear, Vince, and the rest of the crew were on top of them, each one dealing with the threat in their own way. Bear grabbed one of the men, lifting him off the ground with ease, his powerful grip rendering the man helpless. Vince moved swiftly, using his medical training to subdue another without causing serious harm. Jack pinned the stepfather to the ground, his body weight pressing down on him. The man struggled beneath him, but Jack's grip was unyielding. "You've done enough," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends tonight." The stepfather's face twisted in a grimace, but there was fear in his eyes now. He knew he was beaten. "You'll never get away with this," he muttered, but Jack wasn't listening. The other bikers kept their eyes on the remaining two men, making sure they didn't try anything foolish. The stepfather's crew had underestimated them. Jack slowly stood up, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Get them out of here," Jack said, nodding toward the cabin. Vince and Bear moved to escort Maria and her mother inside, making sure they were safe. Jack turned his attention back to the stepfather, who was still lying on the ground, glaring up at him. "This isn't over," the stepfather said weakly, but Jack shook his head. "No," Jack replied, "it is." The stepfather struggled to sit up, but one of the bikers stepped forward, pressing a boot to his chest. "You're not going anywhere," the biker said, his voice cold. "You'll face justice for what you've done." The stepfather's face flushed with anger, but he knew there was no use. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and completely at their mercy. Jack turned away, walking back toward the cabin. The battle was over. They had won. Maria and her mother were safe. The bikers had protected their own, and that was all that mattered. As Jack entered the cabin, he looked over at Maria, who was sitting on the couch with her mother. She was still scared, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes now. Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "You're safe now," he said. Maria nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax, to feel the safety that had been taken from her for so long. Jack knew the journey wasn't over. There would be more obstacles ahead, more challenges to face. But for now, Maria and her mother were safe. And that was enough. The morning after the confrontation with the stepfather, Jack stood outside the cabin, the early sunlight casting long shadows over the quiet landscape. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that reminded him the night was over and the threat had passed. For now, he had made sure the stepfather would no longer be a threat to Maria and her mother, but Jack knew it wasn't over. Not completely. The biker crew had done what they had to do, protected their own, secured the safety of those who needed it most. But they all knew the war wasn't won in a single battle. Jack's mind kept racing as he replayed the events of the last 24 hours. The stepfather had shown up with backup, determined to take Maria back at any cost. But Jack and his crew had stood their ground, ensuring that the little girl and her mother would never have to live in fear of him again. Inside the cabin, Maria and her mother were resting. They had spent the night trying to process the chaos, trying to adjust to the fact that they were safe, for the first time in so long. Maria's mother, though weak and still shaken, was awake. She was sitting up on the couch now, her eyes looking over at Jack with a quiet gratitude. Maria was curled up next to her, her small frame huddled close for comfort, still fearful, but no longer as tense as she had been before. Jack couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. They were safe, at least for now. But he couldn't relax. Not yet. The phone call he had been dreading was inevitable. He needed to inform the authorities. The stepfather might be locked away for the moment, but if Jack knew anything, it was that people like him never gave up that easily. He turned and walked back into the cabin, where the bikers had already started discussing their next move. Bear, always the first to step up, stood near the window, scanning the area outside. He turned as Jack entered. "What's the plan now?" Bear asked, his voice low. Jack stopped and looked around at the rest of the crew. They were all on edge, waiting for his lead. "We wait, but we don't stop moving," Jack said, his voice steady. "We'll stay here, keep them safe. But I'm making the call to the authorities. We can't leave anything to chance. He's got connections, and we need to make sure there's a paper trail this time." Vince, who had been quietly checking on Maria's mother, nodded in agreement. "You're right. We can't let him slip through the cracks again." Jack's eyes narrowed. "We won't. We've come this far, and we're not backing down now." As Jack stepped outside to make the call, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He had promised Tyrone, Maria's father, that he would protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of a contact he trusted in law enforcement. He had worked with this officer before and knew he could count on him to do the right thing. The phone rang twice before the officer picked up. "Jack," the officer said, his voice gruff. "What's going on?" Jack wasted no time. "We've got a situation. The man who's been harassing Maria and her mother, he's here. He tried to take her back last night, but we handled it. He's gone, but I need you to get involved. I'm not letting this go." There was a pause on the other end. Jack could hear the officer's breathing, then a low sigh. "I understand. I'll get the ball rolling, but you know how it works. He's a cop, Jack. It's going to take some time to get the wheels turning." Jack clenched his jaw. "I don't care how long it takes. Just make sure he doesn't get away with it this time. We'll be waiting." "I'll handle it," the officer said. "You stay safe. We don't need any more trouble." Jack ended the call and exhaled slowly, his mind still racing. There was a long road ahead, but for now, he felt a sense of relief. The authorities would do their part, and in the meantime, Jack and the crew would continue to watch over Maria and her mother. He walked back into the cabin and found Maria sitting with her mother, a small smile tugging at her lips for the first time in days. She looked up at Jack, her eyes bright, but still filled with uncertainty. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Jack smiled back, kneeling in front of her. "For now, yes. But we'll keep you safe, Maria. We won't let anything happen to you or your mom." She nodded, her small hand gripping his firmly, a silent promise passing between them. Jack stood up and looked toward the door. The bikers were all there, ready to continue guarding the cabin and ensure that the stepfather wouldn't come back. The sense of unity among them was palpable. They weren't just a gang. They were a family, and they would do anything to protect their own. Jack gave a small nod to the crew. "Let's get some rest. We've got a long road ahead of us. But for tonight, we've done what we needed to." As the bikers settled in, Jack stood by the window, looking out into the woods. The quiet was almost unnerving, but he knew it wouldn't last. He would be ready when the storm returned. Until then, he'd keep his promise, and he would make sure Maria and her mother had a chance at a new beginning. They had already been through too much. It was his job to make sure they never had to face that kind of terror again. Days passed, and the uneasy calm that followed the confrontation began to feel like the eye of a storm. Jack stood outside the cabin, his eyes scanning the distant horizon, his hand resting on the handle of his bike. He had been vigilant ever since the stepfather had been dealt with, but Jack knew they couldn't let their guard down. The authorities were involved now, but the stepfather still had connections, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than what they had seen so far. The crew had settled into a routine, with the bikers taking shifts watching over Maria and her mother. The threat had receded, but the tension remained. They could all feel it, even if they didn't speak about it. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted too. Maria and her mother were starting to relax, finding a semblance of peace that had been absent for so long. Maria's mother, though weak, had started eating again and taking the medication Vince had prescribed. Maria, once so withdrawn, was beginning to show signs of the bright, curious girl she used to be before the chaos had consumed their lives. But Jack knew that this calm wasn't permanent. The stepfather, despite his retreat, would be back. The question was when, and what he would do next. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Bear approaching from behind him. The big man's heavy boots made no sound on the soft earth, but Jack had learned to sense his presence long before hearing it. Bear was always watching, always thinking. "We've got some news," Bear said, his voice low. Jack turned to face him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What's going on?" Bear hesitated for a moment, then handed Jack a piece of paper. "It's from the authorities," Bear said. Jack took the paper, his fingers brushing against it as he read. The news wasn't what he had hoped for. The stepfather had managed to make a phone call from a holding cell. He had connections on the inside, and now there was a warrant out for Jack's arrest. The officer who Jack had spoken to earlier had been compromised. The stepfather had known exactly where to push, and now they were all in danger of being exposed. Jack cursed under his breath, his anger flaring. He knew this wasn't just about keeping Maria and her mother safe anymore. It was about protecting the crew and making sure they didn't get caught in the web the stepfather had spun. "We can't let this go any further," Jack muttered. Bear nodded, his expression grim. "We need to move fast. We can't afford to let him turn this around on us." Jack glanced back toward the cabin, where Maria and her mother were resting. "We'll get them out of here," Jack said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We need to get them to a safer location. The authorities will be looking for us now, and we can't risk staying here any longer." Bear agreed, and the two of them quickly gathered the crew. The bikers were already moving, preparing for another departure. They knew the risks, but they were committed. No one left anyone behind. As they packed up and secured the cabin, Jack took one last look at the place that had been their refuge. The stepfather had made his move, and now they had to outsmart him again. There was no time to waste. They couldn't afford to be caught. The crew mounted their bikes, ready to move. Jack's mind raced as they made their way down the winding road. He had to think ahead. He had to protect Maria and her mother. They couldn't stay in one place for too long. The authorities would be looking for them, and the stepfather would be out there, still plotting his next move. As the bikers rode through the night, Jack's thoughts were fixed on the future. They had to make sure Maria and her mother were safe, and he had to make sure the stepfather wouldn't be able to touch them again. They would keep moving, keep out of sight, and take whatever measures necessary to stay ahead. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jack knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't stop fighting. No matter what it took, they would protect Maria, they would protect her mother, and they would make sure the stepfather paid for what he had done. This fight wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. The road stretched on, the wind howling in their ears as the bikes rumbled through the night. Jack's grip on the handlebars tightened, his thoughts still racing. Maria and her mother were safe, for now, but the reality of what lay ahead weighed heavily on him. The authorities had been alerted, but the stepfather's web of connections was still a looming threat. They had to keep moving, stay ahead of the game, and stay invisible. It wasn't just about running anymore. It was about winning. It was about protecting the vulnerable, giving them a chance to start over. As the convoy moved through the winding roads, the dark trees surrounding them like sentinels, Jack's thoughts turned to the future. He couldn't promise Maria and her mother a perfect life. There were still threats out there, still dangers they couldn't see. But he could promise them this: they wouldn't face them alone. The bikers had become more than just a crew. They were a family, bound together by loyalty and the belief that no one should ever have to face the world alone. Jack's gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, where Bear's bike was just behind him. The big man had been a constant presence throughout this journey, steadfast, unwavering. Jack knew he could rely on him, and the rest of the crew, to keep their word and protect Maria and her mother. "We're not stopping," Jack muttered to himself, determination building in his chest. "Not until it's over." They reached a secluded area on the outskirts of town, the last place they planned to stay before they figured out their next move. A small cabin, hidden away in the woods. They parked the bikes in a tight circle, the engines falling silent, leaving only the sound of the wind. Bear and Vince went inside first, checking the surroundings for any signs of danger. Jack stayed outside, his eyes scanning the area, listening for anything out of the ordinary. It was quiet. Too quiet. He could feel the weight of everything that had happened, the battles fought, the promises made, the lives changed. It felt like they were teetering on the edge of something, and no one knew what would happen next. But Jack knew one thing. He would fight for them. Maria and her mother had already lost too much. They weren't going to lose anymore. As Jack stood there, lost in thought, Maria stepped out of the cabin, her small form silhouetted against the dim light from inside. She looked up at him, her eyes still wide with uncertainty, but there was something different in her gaze now. Something softer. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. The way she walked toward him told Jack everything he needed to know. He knelt down to her level, offering a warm smile. "You're safe here," he said gently. Maria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I know," she whispered. For the first time, there was a flicker of peace in her voice. Jack stood up and placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're all in this together," he said. "No matter what happens, we're family now." Maria nodded again, this time with more confidence. Jack could see it in her eyes. She wasn't the scared little girl who had been running from danger. She was beginning to heal. Jack watched as Maria went back inside, her mother looking up as she entered. The cabin door closed softly behind them, but Jack could still hear the faint murmur of voices inside. He knew it wasn't over. There would still be battles to fight, still more to protect. But at least for tonight, they were safe. They had made it this far. Jack turned back to the rest of the crew. Vince, Bear, and the others had already made their way into the cabin, securing it for the night. Jack took one last look at the woods surrounding them before stepping inside himself. The warmth of the cabin was a stark contrast to the cold, harsh night outside. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the light flickering in the room. Maria's mother had already settled in on the couch, looking exhausted but at peace. Maria was sitting next to her, her small hand resting on her mother's. Jack's heart softened as he looked at them. They had been through so much, and yet, they had found a sense of calm in the chaos. For a moment, everything felt still. Jack walked over to the table where the bikers were gathered, each of them silently watching him. He could see the concern in their eyes, the same look that was in his own. "We've done what we can for now," Jack said, his voice steady. "But we can't stop here. We need to stay one step ahead, keep the pressure on him. This won't be over until he's out of our lives for good." Bear nodded, his eyes sharp. "We'll do whatever it takes. We won't let him come back." Vince leaned forward, his face serious. "We've got connections. We'll make sure he doesn't slip through the cracks again." Jack looked around the room at the crew, his brothers and sisters in arms. He could see the resolve in their faces. They were ready for whatever came next. He felt the weight of his promise to Maria and her mother, but he knew they weren't in this alone anymore. They had a family now, a family that would fight together. "We keep moving forward," Jack said. "No matter what happens, we keep moving forward." And with that, the crew settled in for the night. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped as the shadows danced on the walls. Jack sat back, allowing himself to breathe, if only for a moment. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over.